leave a like and subscribe.
Some of the younger ones genuinely lived for the excitement and intrigue. There was the twins' own cousin Ronnie Hart, a big, good-looking one-time sailor from the Merchant Navy. As he explained, his greatest aim in life was to be different from the ordinary person. Best of all, I'd like to have been a mercenary in the Congo. Being with the twins was easier. It's the adventure that I really go for. With them, it's just like being a spy or something in the underground movement. The secrets and intrigue had their own fascination. So did the air of danger and depravity around the colonel. One of Hart's favorite duties was to take the twins' special guests for a drink at the saloon bar at the Blind Beggar. The place where George Cornell was shot was becoming one of the sights of the East End. There were a lot like Hart who stayed around the twins for the kicks and the adventure, and because Ronnie was a murderer, this had become his principal social asset. That autumn, a pair of unemployed half-Greek brothers called Lambriana tried to become accepted in the firm. Ronnie said they must prove themselves first. Ronnie never understood the ordinary person's ambivalence over murder. Most people seem fascinated by it but never dream of doing it. He dreamed of little else. For him, the terrible taboo between the idea of murder and the reality did not exist. Life was far simpler without it. The nearest he came to giving an excuse for shooting George Cornell was to shrug his shoulders and say, "Well, it needed to be done, didn't it?" Can't see what all the fuss was about. It was because he couldn't see that further tension built up in the firm as he began persuading others to kill. Hart was one of the first. Ronnie seemed to think that because his young cousin wanted adventure, he felt as he did. But when he sent him off to kill a man for him in Romford Market, Hart fired a shot in the air, dropped the gun and ran for it. It was worse with Reggie. Time after time their arguments came back to the point that Reggie must do his one. But Reggie found that while he could shoot a man in the leg or cut him in the face or break his jaw, he drew the line at murder. This saddened Ronnie. "I have to do the dirty work for everyone. Somebody else should have a go." That autumn Ronnie felt increasingly put upon. There were a lot of people needing to be killed. The list was lengthening. Payne was on it now that he had left them. So was Freddie Gore. The man in Romford Market had been included as a favor to a friend in Broadmoor, whose wife he had slept with. Besides him, there were the potential traitors, the competitors, the liberty takers. There was work for everyone, and Ronnie had the idea now of using murder as a test of loyalty. Since all the talk of traitors on the firm, he remembered what he had learnt about the Leopard Men when he was in Nigeria, the secret brotherhood of killers who had terrorized the countryside with ritual murders. With them, murder was used as an initiation to the gang. Later it formed a bond of loyalty between the murderers. Ronnie became excited at the idea. Reggie would have to kill, as his twin brother, his other self. It was imperative, for he and Reggie always shared their secret life. Only when he had killed would they be properly united. But this would be just the beginning. In time, the whole firm could be blooded, all share in the strange brotherhood of killing, all become equally involved. When Ronnie first used Jack the Hat McVitie, he had seemed ready for any villainy. He was a well-known East End character, as strong as a dray horse, and he used to boast that nothing frightened him. He was an old-style fighting man. Only that spring a gang had tried to teach him a lesson by smashing up his hands with a crowbar, but as soon as they were healed he was brawling again. In fact, though Jack the Hat was nowhere near as tough as he appeared. He was a drunk. His nerves had gone. His courage came from the bottle or from enormous pep pills called black bombers. Much of the time he was a cheerful soul, erratic, generous and kind to children. He was vain enough to have earned his nickname from the hat he always wore to cover his baldness, and was proud of his success with women. He treated them in the old East End manner. He casually pushed one mistress he was annoyed with out of his car while traveling at speed and broke her back. This caused him some remorse, but in a day or two, he found another girl to live with. Jack was like that. That summer Ronnie had employed him in the Purple Heart business. It appears that he cheated Ronnie on the money, but Reggie, who liked him, smoothed things over. In September, Ronnie became convinced that Leslie Payne had made a deal with the law and realized that he would be a dangerous witness for the Crown. That same week, Ronnie had a drink with Jack the Hat. He gave him £100, a gun, and Leslie Payne's address. He explained that the £100 was payment on account. There would be £400 more when Leslie Payne was dead. When Reggie heard, he disliked the idea. He disliked most of Ronnie's ideas, but lacked the power to oppose him. He was deep in his own hell and past the point where he could do much against Ronnie. The only peace he knew now was the hour he spent each day by Frances's grave. He had had it planted with red roses and was convinced that something of her spirit lingered there to listen to him. Each day he talked to her, and each day he returned to Ronnie. There was no one else with Frances gone. Ronnie was someone to lean on. When he had drunk enough, Reggie took on his power. When he indulged his hatred and his violence, they became one person. Sober, it was not so easy. There were still moments every day when he was sane and weary, with a deep longing to have finished with it all. Jack the Hat went off to kill Leslie Payne one September evening and bungled it, as Reggie had said he would. He promised he would try again, but Payne had become wary. The days went by. Les Payne was still alive. McVitie still had Ronnie's £100. Threats followed. Ronnie heard that Jack had made a scene at the Foreman's 211 Club in Balham. This was a diabolical liberty, as Foreman was an old friend of the twins. Once again, Reggie smoothed things over. There was a meeting at the Regency. Jack, sober and repentant, told him about his nerves, his debts, his child who was ill. A soft touch as usual, Reggie lent him £50. You should have paid George Cornell as well, stormed Ronnie when he heard and sent fresh threats to McVitie about his money. McVitie, thinking Reggie had let him down, took several bombers, got himself drunk and staggered into the Regency, hat askew, waving a sawn-off shotgun. Next day someone made a point of telling Ronnie how Jack the Hat had threatened to shoot the twins. The Carpenter's Arms is a small pub in a dingy street near Valence Road. The twins bought it that autumn. During these months of crisis, they had not been able to keep their clubs going. This was the last place of their own. But here in Bethnal Green, where they had grown up, they felt secure and knew that they could drink in safety. There was a narrow doorway to the street, a narrow bar. One could see everybody who was there. On weekdays the firm assembled here for orders. At weekends there was sometimes a party for the firm and friends, with womenfolk invited and drinks on the house. The last Saturday in October the Carpenters was crowded. Violet was there. She had left her house just around the corner for a new council flat in Braithwaite House in Shoreditch, but she missed Valence Road and loved a night out with the twins. She kept herself smart for them, a blonde rinse for her hair, a big gold pendant around her neck. Sometimes she laughed and said the worry of the twins helped to keep her young. She was immensely proud of them. Charlie's wife Dolly was there too. She loathed the twins and they loathed her back, but on this family occasion, she had her place, standing aloof from them and very cool. These ladies' evenings were extremely formal. The women sipped their babychams beneath expensive hairdos and kept their places in the old East End manner, genteelly twittering among themselves. All the men would be uncomfortably smart, small strangled knots to ties, stiff white collars, gleaming shoes. They took their style from the Colonel and with his mother present would be painfully restrained. Reggie was an accomplished host. He was attentive to the women and drank little. The serious drinking would start later after the pubs closed. There was a party at a girl called Blonde Carol's house in Evering Road in Stoke Newington. The firm was welcome. Ronnie was the only person at the Carpenters that night who seemed out of things. Most people recognized the danger signs and left him alone. When Reggie talked to him, he found him brooding about McVitie. Since Reggie would not do anything, Ronnie was going to deal with him as he had dealt with George Cornell. McVitie would be at the Regency around 11. Several people who were in the bar that night remember how Reggie changed. He started drinking heavily and at closing time drove off to the Regency. The Regency, North London's smartest rendezvous, was very different from the down-at-heel illicit gambling place the twins had had a share in 7 years before. They had no connection with it now. Two brothers, John and Tony Barry, had stepped in, both of them smart young men. John was the elder and the tougher, broad-shouldered, short, with an assured manner and a white Mercedes. His brother was skinnier and shyer, very much the junior partner. They worked well together, had installed the big upstairs bar, dance floor, restaurant, and the gaming room in the basement. It was a lively place. Much of the Barrys' success came from the way they could keep order without asking questions. Tact was their stock in trade. This was how John Barry had managed to disarm McVitie when he was waving his shotgun and looking for the twins a few days earlier. Still greater tact over the years had saved the Regency from having to pay regular protection money to the twins, although they took the place for granted as their preserve. They and the firm would often go. When they were there, the regulars would be a little careful how they spoke and who was standing near. Drinking men would tend to stand in groups, ready for trouble, the sort of trouble that occurred that night just before 11 o'clock when Reggie burst in with several of the firm, looking for Jack the Hat. It should have been a simple death. Reggie had heard so many times how Ronnie had murdered George Cornell and endured so many taunts about the proper way to kill a man, that it seemed perfectly straightforward. Now he was drunk and violent. He had no scruples about killing. He could not go on letting Ronnie down forever. If he let Ronnie kill McVitie, how could he face himself afterwards? There was no possible alternative. He had his .32 automatic. When he saw Jack the Hat, he would quite calmly shoot him through the head as Ronnie had shot Cornell. That was what Ronnie wanted. Twins had a duty to each other. Slowly it dawned on Reggie that McVitie was not in the Regency. He searched the gaming room, the bar, the restaurant. Ronnie Hart was with him and a man called Bender. The Lambriana brothers joined them. They went to the Barrys' office to ask where McVitie was. Tony Barry was there and asked why they wanted him. Reggie told him. Barry would have known better than to argue had Ronnie been there. With Reggie it was different. He begged Reggie to be sensible. He knew McVitie. The man was a fool, a drunken nobody. He wasn't worth the trouble that would come from murdering him. Reggie made no attempt to answer. Instead, he stood chewing his lip and scowling as he always did at moments of uncertainty. Then he handed Tony Barry the .32, asked him to mind it, and quietly invited the Lambrianas to the party at Blonde Carol's. Hart and Bender were to come too. The violence had gone from Reggie's face. Barry put the gun in the drawer of his desk, thinking another spot of bother was averted. He failed to notice that the man called Bender had a long knife tucked in the waistband of his trousers. Blonde Carol was the sort of woman Ronnie approved of, a thin, pale woman in her middle 20s. She did as she was told, never complained, and kept her mouth shut. The truth was she was scared of him. She had 2 young children from a marriage which had broken up and lived with them in a basement flat in Cazenove Road, Stoke Newington, together with a man who ran a spieler for the twins. Sometimes she had nightmares about Ronnie. The night of her party, he arrived just after 11 o'clock with several of the firm and 2 young boys. He didn't speak or even look at her but stood there scowling in the hall as one of the men explained that Ronnie required her flat for a private party of his own. She knew better than to object and went in and told the guests who had already arrived that they were moving to another party over the road. Nobody complained. Everyone knew Ronnie. As Blonde Carol's guests were leaving, Reggie arrived with Hart, Bender, and the Lambrianas. There were 2 women with them, Hart's girlfriend Vicky, and a young redhead called Carol Thompson. The redhead was a girl Reggie had met at Steeple Bay. As they came down the basement steps, they all seemed ready for a good time, but Blonde Carol heard Ronnie tell his brother that this was no place for women. The women were to go with her. Ronnie was taking charge. Without bothering to ask, He knew Reggie had failed him. If things were left to him, he would end up buying Jack the Hat a drink and lending him another £50. Ronnie was not leaving anything to him again. If Reggie wouldn't kill McVitie, he would. When they were in the sitting room, Ronnie began to give his orders. Before Francis died, Reggie would probably have stopped him, but now he lacked the power and had drunk too much. Ronnie was in command. While Reggie poured himself another drink, young Hart was ordered back to the Regency for the gun he had left in the office. To incriminate the Barrys and make sure that they kept quiet, Ronnie gave strict instructions that Tony Barry was to bring the .32 personally to Cazenove Road. Then it was the Lambrianas' turn. They were good friends of Jack the Hat. He would trust them as he never would the twins. Now was their chance to prove themselves fit to join the firm. They were to follow Hart to the Regency, find Jack the Hat, buy him a drink or two, then ask him round to Carol's party without mentioning the twins. Hart and the Lambrianas left. Reggie appeared to fall asleep. The two boys put a record on and started dancing together. Ronnie watched them. It was a crude trap for an old villain like McVitie, Hart, Tony Barry. The Lambrianas could all have warned him. Even when they failed to, he should have smelled something a little odd about this sudden invitation, but he was probably too drunk. Barry brought the gun and drove off looking scared before he could become still more involved. Young Ronnie Hart returned. Ronnie posted him in an upstairs window facing the street as a lookout. Just before midnight, Hart saw a beaten-up Ford Zodiac draw up. 5 men got out, the Lambrianas, 2 brothers by the name of Mills, and finally a man in a hat, McVitie. Hart gave the alarm. McVitie burst in, ready for a party. "Where's all the birds? All the booze?" he shouted. Ronnie was waiting for him, watching from the sofa. Reggie was behind the door. As Jack the Hat barged past, Reggie tried to shoot him through the head, but the gun jammed. Outside, Big Chrissy Lambriana, who had always wanted to be a gangster, suddenly realized what he had done and was sitting weeping on the stairs. McVitie must have thought that he still had a chance when the gun jammed. When the same thing happened with George Dixon, Ronnie had let him off with a warning. If he decided he deserved a beating up, Jack could take that. But he must soon have seen from Ronnie's face that he was not to be so lucky. Ronnie was shouting at him, his eyes bulging with fury. The Mills brothers and the 2 boys ran from the room. Reggie had thrown away the gun and was grappling him from behind. McVitie, very sober now, tried to be reasonable, but he seemed to have no voice left and Ronnie was shouting incoherently, the others joining in. Suddenly, he managed to break free. In the far corner of the room, there was a window with a wooden frame that looked onto the garden. McVitie made a dive for it, but he got stuck, only his head and shoulders free. The others pulled him back by the legs, then hauled him to his feet. "Be a man, Jack," Ronnie screamed at him. "I'll be a man, but I don't want to die like one." Then it was Ronnie who grabbed him, locking his arms behind him, and Reggie who was holding Bender's carving knife. The room was silent. "Kill him, Reg, do him," hissed his brother. "Don't stop now." McVitie had lost his hat through the window. He stood there looking very bald and gaunt, his long face sweating. "Why are you doing this to me, Reg?" Instead of answering, Reggie pushed the knife into his face below the eye. The butchering followed as McVitie sank to his knees. According to Ronnie Hart, Reggie stabbed his stomach and his chest and finished by impaling him through the throat onto the floor. Reggie claims it was Hart who did the stabbing. Hart admits pushing a handkerchief into McVitie's mouth to stop the flow of blood. Hart says that Bender put his ear to McVitie's chest and pronounced him dead. It was approaching 1 a.m. McVitie's corpse lay in the center of the room, the carpet around him soaked in blood. The party opposite would soon be over. Blonde Carol would soon be coming home. Before she did, the body must be dumped, the worst of the blood mopped up. Once this was done, the twins could say that there had simply been a fight and she was not to talk. So the dismal rigmarole of cleaning up began. The body was humped into the bedroom where Carol's children were asleep. It was slung on to their mother's bed and covered with her bedspread. The Lambrianas started scrubbing the carpet with hot water from the kitchen. When the worst of the mess in the living room had been dealt with, McVitie's body was wrapped in an eiderdown, dragged up the stairs and placed in Bender's car. Ronnie told him to drive it away. Then somebody remembered McVitie's hat. It was his trademark and could easily identify him. When he dived at the window, it fell outside. It was retrieved. Blonde Carol had still not come back, but the twins were restless, particularly Ronnie. Now that the job was done, he had to get away. The others could take care of things. As usual, the twins were worried about getting clean again so that they could face their mother. For this, they chose the house of one man they believed that they could trust. Harry Hopwood had been their parents' best man, an army deserter with their father, and had advised the twins on the best way to do their own military service. They ordered Hart to drive them to his house in Hackney, where they engaged in a sort of ritual cleansing. First, they both bathed thoroughly, soaping themselves all over. Hart says that he remembers having to help wash Reggie's hair as he had cut his hand on the carving knife. Shoes, suits, and every stitch of clothing were left in a pile. Later that day, Hopwood arranged to have them burned. He also burned their paper money and scrubbed their watches, rings, and cufflinks. Then Hart went off to fetch fresh clothes, and Hopwood helped him throw the knife and gun into the Grand Union Canal by Queensbridge Road. At this spot, 10 months later, the police dragged up a jammed .32 automatic. Just after 2 a.m., Blonde Carol came back to her flat. As she came down the stairs, Bender was coming up, his hands in a pair of her children's woolen socks, carrying her plastic washing-up bowl full of blood and water. "Somebody's been hurt," he said. He emptied the bowl into the lavatory. She knew better than to ask questions. Instead, she followed him downstairs and helped him with the scrubbing. When he told her it was no good and that the carpet would have to be destroyed, she still said nothing but watched as he cut the stained part out and tried to burn it in the garden. It was so damp by now that it would barely smolder. Later that day, 2 men arrived with a van and removed every scrap of carpet plus the furniture. The following day, Donahue arrived to mend the broken window in the corner of the room and to redecorate the flat. A new suite of furniture followed. No one said anything. Blonde Carol asked no questions. Once they had washed and changed their clothes, the twins had to get away completely. Ronnie could not allow the deed to be obscured with its sordid aftermath. It was the act of killing he enjoyed, its dreamlike clarity. Others could cope with the dull reality of murder. He would have been depressed by it. Instead, he made McVitie's death the excuse for a short holiday. Hart drove them up to Cambridge, where they booked in for 2 days at the University Arms. Now that Jack the Hat was dead, Ronnie could enjoy it all. He was in high spirits and quite irresponsible, relishing the details of the killing, talking about the way he died and how he looked, the noise he made and how much blood there was. The amount seemed to surprise him. Reggie was stunned by everything at first, and the drink took some time to wear off. Afterwards, Ronnie's good humor was contagious. Here in this solid university hotel, it was hard to believe in the drunken horror of the previous night. He felt safe with Ronnie near him, relieved to know he hadn't let him down. Ronnie's approval meant a lot to him these days. The holiday continued. After 2 days in Cambridge, they drove on to one of the prettiest towns in Suffolk, staying at the principal hotel among the wealthy tourists and country lovers who were enjoying the English autumn. The twins enjoyed it too. They had an old acquaintance who lived nearby. With their help, he had done well for himself, and he was now playing the part of the rich country squire with a large house and an expensive car. The twins visited him, ate his food, rode his horses and rambled across his fields to get fit. Ronnie was living his great adventure. He borrowed the car and had himself driven by the chauffeur to look for a country property for himself. He put on evening dress and went to the local hunt ball. He was beginning to see himself among the local gentry. Reggie got drunk. It was some time before the police so much as knew that Jack the Hat was dead. The woman he had lived with reported him missing the morning after the murder, but his erratic ways were known. The police were inclined to think he had gone missing for some reason of his own. When there was no news of him, there was still nothing for the police to go on. Ronnie had successfully produced a wall of silence by terror. The East End is full of police informers. There were a lot of people who knew that something had gone on that night between the Carpenter's Arms, the Regency, and the flat in Cazenove Road. Not a word reached the police. Despite her new living room carpet, blonde Carol tried to pretend that nothing had happened. The Lambrianas joined the firm, and Jack the Hat joined Frost and Teddy Smith on the missing list at Scotland Yard. The body was never recovered. A year later, the twins were to be found guilty of his murder, but the police and prosecution had to admit that there was no trace of the mortal remains of Jack the Hat. The twins' cousin, Ronnie Hart, turned Queen's evidence and was allowed to go free, and it was largely because of his evidence that the twins were both convicted, along with Bender and the Lambriana brothers. It was also because of him that 2 more men were brought into the case and finally convicted for helping to dispose of Jack McVitie's body, the twins' brother Charlie, and their friend Frederick Foreman. According to Hart's story in court, the twins telephoned Charlie from Hopwood's house when they had bathed and changed their clothes. They were extremely worried. They had told Bender to dump the body somewhere in the East End. Instead, he had telephoned to say that he had driven over London Bridge and parked the car near a church with the body in the back, covered with the eiderdown. Hart claims that Charlie was furious at hearing that the twins had killed McVitie, but that as usual he finally agreed to do what he could to cover up for them, telephoned his old friend Foreman and drove over to Foreman's pub, along with Hart, to make arrangements for McVitie's body to be collected and disposed of. Hart claimed to have heard Foreman saying later that when he got McVitie's body from the car it was covered in slime, but nobody explained what happened afterwards. There were suggestions that McVitie ended up concreted into the foundations of a city block, or was made into pig food on a Suffolk farm, buried in Epping Forest, or fed to the furnaces of Bankside Power Station. All this is hypothetical. Ronnie himself liked spreading false rumors through the firm, and several of these ideas certainly originated with him. But there are 2 important facts which suggest that Jack McVitie had a different end from any of these. The first is that the twins were widely credited with having their own means of disposing of bodies. The second is the evidence that Bender was originally told to dump the body somewhere in the East End. Ronnie seems to have been unconcerned about getting rid of McVitie's body until Bender disobeyed his orders and drove it to the wrong place. This would suggest that the twins had the problem taken care of locally and in some simpler manner than the dramatic methods that have been suggested. The most convincing theory, which was never aired in court, is that the twins had a hold over a local undertaker and made him perform an occasional professional service for them on the side. It is an undertaker's calling to get rid of bodies. It would not take too much ingenuity to arrange for an extra one to disappear. Certainly, there are stories of cremations which the twins paid for. Another theory is that sometimes an additional body was slipped into an occupied coffin before the lid was finally screwed down.
I would like to just come in here and say it's now generally accepted that although Jack McVitie's body was never found, he was buried at sea after Freddie Foreman admitted in a 2000 TV crime documentary that he, along with a fisherman colleague, pushed the dead body of McVitie over the side of a boat wrapped up in chicken wire and weighted down with heavy weights into the deep fishing lanes of the English Channel near Newhaven, Sussex.
If you enjoyed the video, please join our Facebook group. It's called Krays Crime Lords of London. We're a friendly moderated group with over 1,000 Kray and other celebrated gangster videos available for view. There's also thousands of images in the photos sections. The link for the group is in the YouTube description section. I hope we see you there soon.
Leave a like and subscribe.